In this screencast, you'll learn three powerful formulas for what I call conditional math. The first of these is a formula called SUMIF. On the left side of this Excel workbook, I've got a list of transactions or purchases that I made over the last month. I want to view some basic stats about these transactions, like summing up my restaurant expenses for the month. We'll use the column marked expense type to do just that. To start up a SUMIF formula, I'm going to enter the equal sign here and then start typing SUMIF. From the drop-down menu, I'll double-click on that formula to start it up. In Excel, you can either type formulas from scratch or start typing part of it and double-click when it pops up in the autofill. The first thing that I need to highlight is the data that I want to check. Let's highlight the expense type column. Basically, this is what we want the SUMIF formula to check. Now, we'll add a comma and give the formula a condition to check. I'll put restaurant in quotation marks so that it knows to look for only the lines that have restaurant charges on them. Basically, this part of the formula is the criteria of what to look for. Next, let's add a comma and highlight the amount column. These are what we'll sum up to find out our restaurant expenses. Now, I'll close out the formula and press enter. The result here is the amount we spent on restaurant expenses for the month. In the box below, now let's find out how much my purchases $50 or more total up to for the month. Basically, this is a good way to keep an eye on how your big purchases affect your finances. Let's write another SUMIF here, and now let's highlight the amount column. This time, we're highlighting the data that we want to sum up first because it's the same data we want to apply a condition to. Now, let's add a comma, then a quotation mark, a greater than sign, the number 50, and a quotation mark, and then close out the formula. This formula is basically saying, sum up any expense that's greater than $50. Or you could do a less sign here as well. When I press enter, it shows us the total of expenses greater than $50. Now let's switch to the COUNTIF tab, which works very similarly, but instead of summing up the data, it counts the number of times that it appears. Our first COUNTIF will check for the number of clothing purchases in our transaction list. Let's open up with an equals COUNTIF and open up a parentheses. Let's highlight the list of data to review. This is just going to be the expense type. Now I'll add a comma to my formula and put clothing in quotation marks and close the parentheses out. This formula is simply counting the number of times that clothing appears on the list, and you can see the results here. This is the basic formula for a COUNTIF. Highlight what you want to count, and just give Excel a rule for how to count it. Now let's move on to another COUNTIF, the number of times I spent more than $50 on purchases. Again, let's open up with an equals COUNTIF with an open parentheses. This time, I'm going to highlight the list of amounts because I'm counting the number of times we spent more than $50. Let's add a comma, open up quotation marks, and give a greater than sign and 50, then close out the quotation marks, close the parentheses, and press enter. So by now, you can use COUNTIF to kind of keep an eye on those key statistics. Last up, let's learn the AVERAGEIF formula. I'm going to calculate the cost of my average restaurant trip. Let's start off with an equals AVERAGEIF and double click on the formula from the dropdown to get it started. Much like SUMIF, I need to highlight the list of data that I want to test, which is the expense type. Next up, let's add a comma and put quote restaurant, close quotes, and add another comma. This is telling the formula to only average out the restaurant items. Last up, just like SUMIF, I'll highlight the amounts column. This tells the formula to average those amounts. When I press enter, the results of the formula are output. Last example, let's average out my small transactions. I want to know how much I spend on average when I spend $25 or less. Basically, what's my average of transactions below $25? I can use this to keep an eye on my smaller purchases. Let's use another AVERAGEIF. This time, since we aren't restricting it to a specific category, I'll just highlight the amounts. Then I'll add a comma and a condition to test. In quotation marks, I'll put a less sign and then 25. Let's close out our quotation marks and then add a parentheses. This shows us how much our average purchase is when it's less than $25. So that's all you need to know to use SUMIF, COUNTIF, and AVERAGEIF. These conditional math formulas are great for adding basic stats to your data. I'm Andrew Childress for Tuts Plus, and thanks for joining.